A 15-year-old girl seeking refuge in the U.S. was expelled by Immigration and Customs Enforcement without appearing before an immigration judge. That girl's name was Marjorie. She fled Guatemala, claiming her stepfather sexually abused her. Marjorie brought with her a complaint signed by a local judge that detailed the alleged abuse. But CBS News has learned she was never allowed to present her case and instead was sent back to Guatemala. Marjorie is one of hundreds of thousands of migrants that have been expelled by border agents during the pandemic. Many of them have been denied a hearing, as officials cite public health concerns. For more, let's bring in CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, welcome. It's really good to see you. You know, this story is heartbreaking. Talk to us a little bit more about Marjorie's case. How might her situation have been different had she been allowed to present her evidence to a judge?
Yes, good evening, Elaine. 15-year-old Marjorie, as you mentioned, fled Guatemala approximately 3 weeks ago and headed to the U.S.-Mexico border. She brought with her, as you mentioned, a complaint signed by a judge in Guatemala that detailed her stepfather's alleged attempts to sexually abuse her in her home. And she hoped that that document would be her gateway to U.S. protection and for a chance to reunite with her father, who actually lives and works in Pennsylvania. But instead of allowing her to present this evidence to an immigration judge, an asylum officer, or a lawyer, U.S. border officials briefly detained Marjorie and then placed her on a deportation flight back to Guatemala. Now she's living with her godmother because, as we discussed, she cannot return to her mother's house because that's where her stepfather and alleged abuser lives. And this is a seismic shift in policy, Elaine. Before the pandemic, unaccompanied migrant children like Marjorie were allowed to temporarily stay in the U.S. They were sent to government-overseen shelters where they could stay while they waited to be placed with sponsors who are typically family members in the U.S. They could apply for asylum or other forms of humanitarian relief from deportation. Several lawyers told me that Marjorie would have been eligible for a humanitarian visa designed for immigrant children who were abused, neglected, or abandoned.
You know, it's just so disturbing to hear about a girl making a trek like this, clutching with her all the while documentation that she hoped she could present to a U.S. judge in the hopes that she would at least be able to be heard, but as you report, that didn't happen. So government data shows that Marjorie is one of an estimated 270,000 migrants who have been expelled by border authorities since March. How have government officials explained that? Is that legal?
Sure. So since March, the Trump administration has been expelling most border crossers who lack proper documents to enter the country, under the premise that detaining them and processing them under regular U.S. immigration laws, Elaine, will spur coronavirus outbreaks in migrant holding facilities, endanger border agents, and potentially strain U.S. hospitals by cases of migrants with COVID. They are citing a law that dates back to the late 19th century that allows the government to suspend the entry of people suspected of transmitting a communicable disease. But 3 federal judges have actually concluded, Elaine, that this law that the administration has been citing does not actually authorize expulsions and that it does not suspend the protections that Congress created for unaccompanied migrant children like Marjorie, even during a public health emergency. And although this policy has been authorized by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we have reported at CBS, Elaine, that this policy was approved under White House pressure and over objections from career officials at the CDC, who believed that there was no public health basis for such a sweeping policy.
It's an important point. Well, the Trump administration has been pushing forward with the president's immigration agenda during his final months in office. What changes have we seen so far, and what else can we expect in these coming weeks?
Sure. So there are only several weeks left of the outgoing Trump administration, but we have already seen that this administration is still moving to implement some controversial immigration changes. One of them is an attempt to exclude undocumented immigrants, Elaine, from the federal count that is used to allocate seats in the House of Representatives. This would be a move that would disproportionately affect states with large immigrant communities like Texas and California, and they can potentially lose seats in the House of Representatives if this move is actually implemented. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments over this attempt this week, and many of the justices seem skeptical of the legality of this move because the 14th Amendment actually says that all persons in the U.S. should be counted for this process of allocating seats in Congress. Even some conservative judges, like Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was the latest addition to the bench, asked the government attorney that whether or not someone who has lived here for 20 years, even if illegally, is not a settled resident and should be counted for this process. We also expect the administration to finalize a regulation, Elaine, that further restricts access to the asylum system for border crossers. It would effectively disqualify victims of gang persecution and gender-based violence from being able to qualify for asylum.
Well, Camilo, we know that President-elect Joe Biden has promised to reverse many of the Trump administration's immigration policies. What more do we know about his plans for immigration and what kind of challenges he might face in implementing those plans?
Yeah, so we can expect the incoming Biden administration to take immediate steps to undo many of Mr. Trump's immigration policies. We can expect the incoming Biden team to draft new guidelines narrowing who ICE can arrest and deport from the country. As you perhaps can remember, Elaine, during the Obama administration, ICE officials focused on deporting immigrants with certain criminal convictions, recent border crossers, and those who re-enter the country after being deported. Mr. Trump scrapped all those guidelines and said that effectively anyone is fair game for enforcement. So we can expect a return to those policies. We can expect a ramping up of refugee admissions. Mr. Trump has slashed refugee admissions to a historic low, and Mr. Biden has pledged to institute a 125,000 cap during his first year in office. That is a lofty goal because the current cap stands at 15,000, and it could be complicated by the fact that the resettlement infrastructure here in the U.S. has been decimated because of these dramatic cuts to the system. We can also expect the Biden administration to undo the so-called public charge rule, which makes it more difficult for low-income immigrants to obtain green cards. So we can expect a lot of changes in some lane, but I will say that all the changes and the success of these changes will hinge on whether the courts allow the Biden administration to just undo basically Mr. Trump's immigration legacy, because as we've seen during the past 4 years, federal courts have been a hindrance for the Trump administration's immigration objectives.
All right, a lot to watch. Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine.